Tonight, we're going to explore the one question that sits at the center of every space program on Earth right now. Not whether we can build the rocket, not whether we can calculate the trajectory, not whether we can grow food on another planet, extract water from Martian soil, or construct a habitat that holds its seal against a vacuum. Those are engineering problems. And engineering, given enough time and enough money, and enough brilliant people pointed in the same direction, has a way of being solved. The question we're going to sit with tonight is different, older, and in some ways far more uncomfortable than any engineering problem we have ever faced. Can a human being survive deep space? Not the concept of a human being, not a theoretical astronaut in a simulation. An actual person with actual cells and actual bones and an actual nervous system built over billions of years for one very specific world. Can that person leave this world, cross the void between planets, and arrive on the other side as themselves? And when I say survive, I want to be precise about that word. I don't mean survive the way a crash survivor survives. I don't mean make it there and back alive and technically breathing. I mean survive intact, survive whole. Survive with the same body, the same brain, the same eyes, the same bones, the same immune system, the same psychological architecture that they had when they left. Because here is the thing that doesn't get talked about in the announcements and the press conferences and the beautiful concept renders where silver spacecraft glide toward a rust-colored planet against a field of stars. The universe is not hostile to us. That word doesn't quite fit. Hostile implies an intent. An active enemy that perceives you, turns toward you, and wants to cause you harm. The void is something else entirely. It is simply indifferent. And that indifference, that absolute absence of any accommodation for life, is what makes it so dangerous, because it will dismantle you slowly, systematically, thoroughly, and without any malice at all. It won't even know you were there. In March of 2026, NASA's 4 Artemis II astronauts were placed into a 2-week quarantine. Pre-flight protocol, standard procedure before a crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit. The first such mission in more than 50 years. And while they were preparing themselves, while they were running through checklists and fitness protocols and sleeping in controlled environments and eating controlled diets, scientists inside the Human Research Program were tracking something called the red risks. The red risks are not science fiction. They are not speculation dressed up in bureaucratic language. They are a formal, documented, actively maintained categorization inside one of the most rigorous scientific institutions in the world. A list of the threats that researchers believe are most likely to occur during deep space missions, and most likely to be catastrophic when they do. Each one backed by peer-reviewed evidence. Each one assigned a likelihood score and a consequence score that together determine how much research attention and resources it receives. They include the steady, ceaseless bombardment of galactic cosmic rays, particles that have crossed millions of light years and will pass through a spacecraft wall without slowing down. They include a neurological syndrome that quietly, persistently, physically reshapes the structure of the human eyeball over months in orbit. They include behavioral health risks, the slow, grinding psychological erosion that happens to a human mind when it is placed inside a sealed container and pointed at a destination that is hundreds of millions of kilometers away, surrounded by a silence so complete it has no equivalent on Earth. And beneath all of these individual risks, quietly connecting them all, there is a single fact, a biological fact, the kind that doesn't make it into mission announcements because it doesn't have a clear solution yet. We were not built for this. What nobody knew at the time In all the early decades of space exploration, when astronauts came home thinner and weaker and squinting and moving carefully down gangways on unsteady legs, what nobody fully understood yet was that the problem wasn't one thing. It wasn't the radiation alone, or the lack of gravity alone, or the isolation alone. It was everything, working together, compounding each other, amplifying risks that were already individually significant into a combined burden that current science is still learning to measure. Tonight, we are going to go all the way inside, not just into the science, though the science is extraordinary, into the bone, into the eye, into the blood, into the brain, into the small, dark rooms where 6 volunteers lived for 520 days pretending to be on their way to Mars, and what happened to them inside those rooms when the weeks stopped feeling like weeks and started feeling like a wait. We're going to follow the physics and the biology and the psychology of what happens to a human body when you remove it from the only conditions it has ever known in the entire arc of life on this planet. And at the end, we're going to ask the question that serious scientists are beginning to ask quietly, in the margins of their papers and at the edges of their conferences. What if we can't go there as we are? What if the mission to Mars requires not just better engineering, but a different kind of human being entirely? There's no rush tonight. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders settle. Let the day go somewhere else. We're going to take our time with this one because it deserves it. We're going somewhere far from here, and we're going to get there slowly. The stars have always been there. Every human civilization that has ever existed on this planet has looked up at the same points of light and felt something. Curiosity, wonder, the specific kind of longing that comes from seeing something beautiful and unreachable at the same time. We told stories about them. We built calendars around them. We navigated by them across oceans we didn't know the extent of. And when we finally built machines capable of reaching them, even the nearest ones, we assumed the main challenge would be the machines. It turns out the main challenge is us, not because we lack courage, or intelligence, or determination. The people who go to space are among the most rigorously selected and trained individuals in human history. They are physically exceptional. They are psychologically resilient. They are capable of performance under pressure that most people cannot approach. And the space agencies that send them are staffed with brilliant scientists and engineers who have solved problems that seemed impossible until they were solved. The challenge is something more fundamental than any of that. The challenge is that evolution had billions of years and one planet, and it did an extraordinary job of building us for that planet, and only for that planet. Every cell in the human body carries the assumption of Earth inside it. Every system, cardiovascular, skeletal, immune, neurological, endocrine, is tuned to the specific, narrow, improbable conditions of one small world in the outer arm of one galaxy among hundreds of billions. Remove those conditions and the tuning starts to drift. That is what tonight is about. Not just the science of spaceflight medicine, though the science is extraordinary. The deeper question behind it. What are we, really, as biological organisms? What are the actual limits of the container that carries human experience through the universe? And what does it mean that we have gotten far enough, as a species, to be asking whether we need to redesign that container in order to go further? Get comfortable. Let the day settle into the background. We're going to take our time. The question of what happens to a human body in space has been accumulating answers for more than 60 years. But for most of that time, the answers were partial, observed in passing, attributed to adaptation, to the novelty of the environment, to the short duration of the missions. Astronauts came home changed, recovered, went back. The changes were noted. The recovery was taken as evidence that the changes were acceptable. What the science of the last 2 decades has established. Slowly, carefully, through the accumulation of data from the ISS and from the increasingly sophisticated tools of molecular biology and neuroimaging and genomics, is that the changes are not simply side effects of a challenging environment. They are the body doing exactly what it evolved to do, adapting to new conditions. The problem is that the new conditions are so far outside the range. The body evolved for that the adaptation itself becomes the problem. The bone that stops maintaining itself because there is no gravity to signal that maintenance is necessary. The eye that reshapes because the fluid dynamics of the skull were never calibrated for a world without a gravitational down direction. The immune system that shifts its resource allocation in ways that were adaptive in the ancestral environment and are maladaptive in the spacecraft. These are not failures. They are the body working correctly, in the wrong environment. That is the insight that makes this problem genuinely hard. You cannot simply train harder or eat better, or take a pill that keeps the body from adapting to microgravity. The adaptation is the biology doing its job. The challenge is that the job it was built to do is not the job that the mission requires. Tonight we are going to look at all of it, not just the headlines, the radiation risk, and the bone loss that tend to dominate the public conversation about space medicine, but the layers beneath, the eye changes and the brain shifts and the microbiome and the psychology and the nutritional biochemistry and the genetics. The full picture of what the interplanetary environment asks of the human organism and what current science can and cannot do in response. And we are going to sit with the question that sits behind all of the specific risks. A cosmological question, a philosophical question, a biological question. The question of whether creatures shaped so completely by one world can ever truly leave it. There is no simple answer, but the question itself, held gently and without urgency, in the quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, has a weight and a beauty that I think is worth carrying for a while. So let's begin. One more thing before we go further. A note about pace. Everything we're about to discuss is real science. The studies are published, peer-reviewed, and conducted by researchers at institutions with no reason to exaggerate the findings. NASA's Human Research Program is not in the business of overstating risk. It has every institutional reason to be conservative in its assessments, and the risks it has formally classified as red remain red despite that conservatism. But none of it is presented tonight as a reason to stop, as a verdict against the aspiration, as a closed door. It is presented as what it is, the honest, detailed current state of what the science knows. And the science knowing it, clearly, specifically, quantitatively, is the first step toward doing something about it. You cannot fix what you cannot see. And we are, for the first time in human history, seeing this clearly enough to begin. So let's see it together. Let's start at the beginning of the journey, with the world that made us, and follow the physics all the way out to the question of who we have to become to cross the distance between worlds. But this story doesn't start with the dangers of space. It doesn't start with radiation or isolation, or the terrifying logistics of sending a small group of people to a planet that is, at certain points in its orbit, more than 400 million kilometers away. It starts with something quieter, something so embedded in ordinary life that we have never once in our entire lives had a reason to think about it. It starts with the fact that we belong here, not here in a vague philosophical sense, not here in the way people say it at the end of a long journey or a difficult year. Here, in the precise, specific, measurable, biological sense, human physiology is not a general-purpose machine. It is not something that was designed to function in a range of environments and can be adjusted like a thermostat when conditions change. It is the product of the full depth of biological history on one planet, refined inside one very specific, very narrow, very particular set of conditions. One atmosphere of pressure, 14.7 pounds per square inch, pressing inward on every surface of your body at every moment of every day you have ever lived. You have never felt it, you will never feel it, but remove it, and you will feel its absence within seconds in ways that are not survivable without intervention. 9.8 meters per second squared of gravitational acceleration, not more, not less. The exact figure that keeps your blood in your feet, keeps your organs positioned where your body expects them to be, keeps your bones dense because your skeleton is spending every waking moment resisting a force that wants to pull everything toward the ground. Walk, stand, sit. All of it is a continuous negotiation with gravity. Every step is a controlled fall. Every moment of uprightness is a physiological achievement. A magnetic field that extends roughly 65,000 kilometers above the surface. A vast invisible bubble of charged particles generated by the movement of liquid iron in the planet's outer core. This field does something so important, and does it so quietly, that it is essentially invisible to daily life. It deflects galactic cosmic rays. It bends the paths of the most energetic particles in the known universe, sends them spiraling around the planet, keeps them from reaching the surface at the intensities they travel through interstellar space. Without it, life on the surface would receive a level of radiation exposure that would make sustained complex biology essentially impossible. And above all of this, the atmosphere, a layer of gas approximately 100 kilometers thick, mostly nitrogen and oxygen with traces of argon and carbon dioxide, and a dozen other compounds. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation. It scatters visible light in ways that give us a blue sky and red sunsets. It moderates temperature swings that would otherwise make the surface inhospitable. It gives us something to breathe. And it adds its own layer of pressure protection, sitting above the mechanical pressure of sea level, creating the conditions that allow liquid water to exist and stay liquid and sustain the chemistry of life. Remove any one of these things, just one, without replacing it artificially, and the biology fails. Remove all of them simultaneously, and the biology fails in ways that are immediate and absolute. This is the framework that scientists who study human spaceflight have organized under a single concept. They call it the Space Exposome. The word comes from environmental health research. The exposome is the total sum of all environmental exposures a person has over their lifetime. Everything they breathe, everything they absorb, every physical force they experience, every chemical interaction between their body and their world, and the way those exposures interact with their individual genetic makeup to shape their long-term health. The Space Exposome takes that concept and applies it to spaceflight. What are all the things that change when a human being leaves Earth? How do those changes interact with each other? And how do they interact with the specific biological profile of the specific person making the journey? The Human Research Program at NASA has organized the answer into 5 broad categories. Space radiation, the galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events that bombard anything outside the Earth's magnetic shield. Altered gravity fields, the shift from 9.8 meters per second squared to effectively 0, and then perhaps to 3.7 on Mars, a number nobody has sustained for long enough to have good data on. Isolation and confinement. What months or years in a small sealed space with a small fixed group of people does to the brain and the behavioral systems. Hostile and closed environments. The accumulated effects of recycled air, limited natural light, restricted diet, elevated CO2, and the psychological weight of a world bounded by metal walls and distance from Earth, not just the physical distance, but the operational reality of being so far away that a request for help takes 44 minutes to be received and answered, which in a medical emergency might as well be an eternity. Each of these 5 categories generates its own set of documented risks. The Human Research Program currently tracks more than 30 distinct health risks associated with spaceflight. More than 30. And the critical insight of the Space Exposome framework, the thing that makes it more than just a list, is that these risks are not independent. They compound, they interact, they amplify each other in ways that are still being mapped. The radiation damages the immune system. This has been observed in astronauts and confirmed in laboratory models. The damaged immune system is less capable of managing the altered microbiome that develops in microgravity, where the microbial population of the gut shifts in ways that are not fully understood, but are consistently documented. The microgravity causes fluid to shift toward the head, which affects the brain, which affects decision-making and reaction time and mood, which affects behavioral health, which affects crew cohesion. The isolation and confinement elevate cortisol, the stress hormone, which suppresses immune function further, which creates another loop back to radiation susceptibility. Think about that for a moment. Not just one problem with one solution. A web of interacting problems where the solution to any single thread has to account for every thread connected to it. We've sent 630 people to space. Only 24 have ventured beyond low Earth orbit, all of them to the Moon during a brief window between 1968 and 1972. 12 walked on the lunar surface. And in everything we've learned from those missions, and from 60 years of low Earth orbit operations since, one thing has been remarkably consistent. Every single time we send someone up there, something changes in their body that wasn't supposed to change. In 1961, Alan Shepard spent 15 minutes in space. 15 minutes in a capsule barely large enough to sit in, on a suborbital arc that took him to an altitude of 187 kilometers and brought him back down into the Atlantic Ocean. 15 minutes, and the medical teams monitoring his data were already watching things shift. Fluid redistribution toward the head, the early signatures of a cardiovascular system beginning to recalibrate for an environment it had never encountered. 15 minutes was enough for the body to start adapting. The Apollo missions extended exposure to 2 weeks. The medical data coming back from those missions was more detailed and more sobering. Bone loss, muscle atrophy at rates that were measurable even in that short time, changes in cardiovascular function, fluid distribution patterns that persisted into the recovery period. The 12 men who walked on the Moon were elite physical specimens, among the most rigorously screened and trained humans in history. They came home from their missions and spent weeks recovering from experiences that lasted days. The International Space Station extended exposure to 6 months, then 12, then more. And with each extension, the data became richer, more granular, more precise, and in some ways more worrying, because the longer you look, the more you find. Now we are asking these bodies to go to Mars. Not for 2 weeks, not for 6 months, for 940 days, roughly 2.5 years, in an environment that exists entirely outside, everything their biology evolved to handle. Let's start with the most basic question, because it grounds everything that follows. What is a spacesuit? Not armor, not a vehicle, not exploration equipment in the way a climbing harness or a dive tank is exploration equipment. A spacesuit is a wearable biosphere. It is a miniature Earth, a small, pressurized, temperature-controlled, oxygen-supplied, carbon dioxide scrubbing bubble of the exact conditions that human life requires, assembled from layers of mylar and Kevlar and Dacron and neoprene-coated nylon, and shaped to fit the contours of a specific human body. Every single component of that system has one job: keeping a terrestrial organism alive in an environment that would kill it in approximately 90 seconds without intervention. If the pressure drops too low, if there's a breach, if a seal fails, the physics become brutal very quickly. The moisture in your lungs begins to vaporize, not boil, because boiling requires heat, and space is not hot. Vaporize because at pressures low enough, the threshold for liquid to exist drops below body temperature, and the fluids that your body is made of begin to change state. The saliva in your mouth, the fluid lining your airways, the blood in your capillaries near the skin. Your body becomes a collection of pressure vessels trying to hold liquid that the surrounding environment wants to turn to gas. If the pressure goes too high, if the regulation system fails in the other direction, the suit becomes a rigid balloon. The joints lock. The wearer cannot bend their arms or legs, cannot operate equipment, cannot perform the tasks they went there to perform. In a worst case, cannot survive. The Apollo-era spacesuits weighed 180 pounds on Earth. In microgravity, weight is not the issue. Mass is, and that mass had to be controlled, repositioned, operated precisely in every EVA, every moonwalk, every moment outside the protective hull of the spacecraft. The engineering required to make that possible was extraordinary, but the engineering was always in service of a more fundamental problem. How do you carry Earth with you when you leave? The answer is, you build a container for it, brilliant and expensive and precisely calculated, a little bubble of the one world the person inside it was built for. And then you ask what happens to the person inside the bubble, over months and years, when that bubble is all they have. There's a concept in ecology called the niche. The ecological niche of a species is not just the place it lives. It is the entire set of conditions that the species has evolved to require. Temperature range, humidity, available food types, predator and prey relationships, light cycles, pH of the water or soil. A species doesn't just occupy its niche, it is built for it at the molecular level in ways that are often invisible until you try to remove the species from those conditions. The human ecological niche is Earth, and it is specific in ways that feel abstract until you start looking at the mechanisms. Take something as basic as the circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour biological clock that governs sleep, hormone release, body temperature, immune function, and dozens of other physiological processes. This clock evolved in synchrony with the 24-hour rotation of the Earth. The light-dark cycle that has been present for billions of years, since before complex life existed. Human biology is so deeply entrained to this cycle that disrupting it, shift work, transatlantic travel, anything that decouples the internal clock from the external light signal, produces measurable deterioration in health across virtually every system studied. On the ISS, the station orbits Earth every 90 minutes, 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets per day. The windows are managed with artificial lighting to try to maintain a 24-hour rhythm for the crew. But the light that reaches them through those windows does not have the same spectrum as Earth sunlight. The timing is artificial. And the circadian disruption that results, documented in sleep quality data, in hormone profiles, in cognitive performance metrics from ISS crews, is one of the background noise levels of physiological stress that all long-duration astronauts operate with, added to everything else. On a Mars transit, the situation is different but not better. The spacecraft will be oriented relative to the Sun in ways determined by thermal management and power generation, not by human circadian preferences. Light levels inside will be whatever the lighting system provides, and after arrival on Mars, the Martian day, the Sol, is 24 hours and 37 minutes, close enough to Earth that astronauts can partially entrain to it, as the Mars rover teams on the ground have discovered by living on Mars time, but not identical, not what the clock inside every human cell evolved to expect. This is one thread, a single example of the specificity of the human ecological niche and what happens when you try to operate outside it. There are dozens more. The gut microbiome, which evolved in relationship to Earth's microbial world, to the specific diversity of bacteria and fungi and phages that populated the environments our ancestors lived in, has no reference point for the microbial monoculture of a spacecraft's recycled air system. The immune system, which calibrated its responses over millennia of exposure to Earth's pathogens, does not have a prepared response to the ways that those same pathogens may change their behavior in microgravity. The endocrine system, which uses day length and temperature variation and dozens of environmental cues to regulate seasonal and daily hormonal rhythms, finds those cues absent or distorted in the sealed, temperature-controlled, artificially lit environment of a deep space habitat. None of this means that humans cannot go to Mars. People go to Antarctica. People work in submarines for months. People adapt to environments that differ significantly from the conditions they evolved in, and they manage. The question is always, at what cost and for how long? And what happens to the things that get used up in the adaptation? The Space Exposome framework is an attempt to answer that question systematically, to stop looking at individual risks in isolation and start understanding the human body in the spaceflight environment as a system, complex, interconnected, adaptive, and operating under accumulated stress from multiple directions simultaneously. One more thing about the foundation before we move outward. The astronauts who board spacecraft for long-duration missions are not the median human being. They have been selected from thousands of applicants on the basis of physical health, psychological stability, cognitive performance, and professional competence. They are, by virtually any measure, the healthiest and most capable people available. They receive medical care and monitoring that exceeds what most people will encounter in their entire lives. They follow exercise protocols and dietary guidelines developed by teams of specialists. They are tracked more closely and supported more continuously than anyone outside of a clinical research setting. And even so, with all of that, they come back changed. They come back with lower bone density. They come back with altered vision. They come back with cardiovascular systems that need weeks to readjust to the demands of standing and walking. They come back and are carried off the capsule on stretchers as standard procedure, not because something went wrong, but because this is the expected state of a healthy person who has been in space for 6 months. The question we're asking tonight is, what happens when the mission is 5 times longer? And the destination is 5 times further, and there's no coming back until the mission is complete. There is one more foundational piece that sets the stage for everything that follows, and it has to do with timescales. The adaptations we are going to look at, the bone loss, the fluid shifts, the immune changes, the behavioral patterns, all of them happen on timescales that range from hours to months. They are relatively fast in biological terms because they are within lifetime adaptations. Phenotypic plasticity, the body changing its operating parameters in response to changing conditions without changing its underlying genetic blueprint. Evolutionary adaptation, the kind of deep change in the genome that could, in principle, make humans genuinely suited for interplanetary space, happens over thousands or millions of generations. We do not have that kind of time in the context of Mars missions that are being planned for the 2030s and 2040s. This is why the Countermeasures program exists and why it is so ambitious and so difficult. It is trying to do, through medicine and engineering and exercise and nutrition and psychology, in a few decades, what evolution would do over geological time. It is trying to extend the operating envelope of the human body into a range that the body was never designed for, using tools built within the lifetime of the people who need them. That is an extraordinary undertaking, and it is the context for every specific risk and every specific countermeasure that we are about to look at. The foundation is set. Now let's move outward. The moment a spacecraft crosses the boundary of Earth's magnetosphere, not the atmosphere, which is a much lower boundary, but the magnetopause, the outer edge of the magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space, something changes in the physics of the environment around it. Inside the magnetosphere, the Earth's magnetic field is doing constant work. It is deflecting and redirecting the stream of galactic cosmic rays, those high-energy particles that have crossed millions or billions of light years from their sources, accelerated to velocities approaching the speed of light by supernova explosions and neutron stars and the violent events at the hearts of distant galaxies. The magnetosphere doesn't block them completely. Some get through, particularly at the poles where the field lines converge, but it reduces the flux significantly, keeps the surface dose at levels that life on Earth has, adapted to over geological time. Cross the magnetopause, and that protection ends. What remains between the spacecraft and the full intensity of the galactic cosmic ray environment is the hull. Aluminum, mostly, in current designs, perhaps a few centimeters thick, and the bodies of the people inside. Galactic cosmic rays are not like any radiation that comes up in normal life or normal medical contexts. When we talk about radiation risk from X-rays, from CT scanners, from the background radiation that exists at sea level, we are talking about low-LET radiation, low linear energy transfer. These are photons primarily, or low-energy electrons. They deposit their energy relatively diffusely as they pass through tissue. They produce isolated breaks in DNA strands, damaging, potentially serious, but the kind of damage that the cell's repair machinery evolved to handle. The break is found, it is fixed, or it isn't fixed, and the cell is flagged for apoptosis, for programmed death, before it can propagate the error. Galactic cosmic rays are something else. They are HZE particles, high charge, high energy. Heavy atomic nuclei stripped of their electrons, iron, silicon, titanium, oxygen, carbon, moving at speeds that in some cases approach 90% of the speed of light. And the damage they leave behind when they pass through biological tissue is not at all like the damage from an X-ray. As an HZE particle moves through a cell, it deposits energy in a dense, concentrated track along its path. Not a diffuse scatter, a corridor, a line of devastation through whatever molecular structures happen to be in the way. DNA in that corridor doesn't receive a single clean break that the repair enzymes can locate and seal. It receives clustered, complex damage, multiple simultaneous breaks along the same region of the same chromosome, along with chemical modifications to the bases, along with damage to the surrounding protein structures that would normally facilitate repair. The cell's repair machinery arrives at this scene and finds something it was not built to handle. The repair proteins evolved in an environment where this type of damage essentially did not exist. They don't have a protocol, and the consequence of an incorrect repair, of two broken ends being rejoined in the wrong configuration, is potentially worse than leaving the break alone. It can produce mutations. It can produce chromosomal rearrangements that quietly, over years, tip a cell toward malignancy. Francis Cucinotta, a radiation biologist who worked for years with NASA's Space Radiation Risk Program, led the team that built the most comprehensive quantitative models of radiation risk for space exploration. The projections his group published for a 940-day Mars mission. The conjunction-class mission profile, where Earth and Mars are in favorable orbital alignment, and the crew spends roughly 540 days on the Martian surface, with transit times totaling around 400 days, are among the most sobering numbers in the entire literature of space medicine. NASA's occupational safety standard limits astronaut radiation exposure to a 3% risk of exposure-induced death, evaluated at the upper 95% confidence interval of the risk estimate. 3%, that is the line. That is what is considered acceptable for the people who go to space on behalf of the rest of us. For a 940-day Mars mission, Cucinotta's central estimates for radiation-induced cancer mortality exceeded 5%. The upper 95% confidence interval, the bound that NASA uses for its official limit, climbed toward 10%. And when you add the risk of serious radiation-induced cardiovascular disease, which is a separate and independently documented risk from cosmic ray exposure, the morbidity figure, not death, but serious illness, approaches 20% in the upper bound of the model. And no, I'm not making that up. That number comes from a peer-reviewed paper published in PLOS ONE, authored by researchers affiliated with NASA and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. 20%. 1 in 5 returning Mars astronauts, at the upper bound of current projections, could face serious radiation-induced illness within their lifetime. And that is before accounting for the risks to the central nervous system that current models cannot yet fully quantify. Because the brain is not exempt from cosmic ray exposure, the same HZE particles that fracture DNA in other tissues pass through neurons too. And what rodent studies have shown, conducted at particle accelerator facilities that simulate galactic cosmic ray conditions, is that HZE exposure produces measurable changes in the brain, not just in the structure of individual neurons, but in the functional networks between them. In the hippocampus, the region most associated with memory formation and spatial navigation, Iron-56 particle exposure at doses well below what a Mars crew would receive produced behavioral and cognitive impairments in animal models. Not subtle impairments at the edge of detection, measurable, consistent, reproducible impairments. More recently, studies have found that iron particle radiation appears to accelerate the development of Alzheimer's-like pathology in animal models genetically predisposed to the disease. The amyloid plaques, the tau tangles, the neurofibrillary degeneration that characterizes the disease. In irradiated animals, the timeline of development compresses. The disease appears earlier and progresses faster. What this means for a crew of 4 to 6 people spending 940 days in the interplanetary radiation environment is a question that nobody can currently answer with confidence. The data exists only from animal models. The scaling to humans involves enormous uncertainty, but the direction of the evidence is not reassuring. But here's the detail that often gets missed in discussions about the radiation problem. The radiation problem isn't the only thing happening to the body out there. It isn't even the most immediately visible. The changes that happen fastest, that astronauts notice first, that start within hours of reaching orbit, come from something else entirely. They come from the absence of the thing that was always there. The moment you enter freefall, and orbit is freefall, a continuous falling toward Earth, that the forward velocity converts into a curve rather than a descent, your body begins solving a problem it no longer has. Every system that was built to oppose gravity has no gravity to oppose. And those systems don't simply switch off cleanly. They adapt, they adjust, they recalibrate for the new conditions. The heart, which evolved to pump blood upward against gravity to supply the brain, finds that the blood is no longer pooling in the legs. It distributes more evenly. The cardiovascular system reads this as volume expansion, too much blood in the central circulation, and begins down-regulating. It produces less of the hormones that retain fluid. The kidneys excrete more. Blood volume decreases. Over weeks, the heart muscle itself changes. Without the same hemodynamic demands it faced on Earth, it becomes slightly smaller, more efficient for the new environment, less capable of performing at Earth normal levels when it returns to Earth. Bone density begins declining within weeks of reaching orbit. The mechanism is mechanical. Bone is a dynamic tissue, constantly being broken down by osteoclast cells and rebuilt by osteoblast cells. The balance between those two processes is regulated in part by the mechanical loading signals that come from gravity. When you stand, walk, run, the bones in your legs and spine and hips are under compression. That compression signals the osteoblast to stay active. Remove compression, and the signal disappears. Osteoclast activity continues. Osteoblast activity slows. The net result is bone loss. The rate is approximately 1:1 and 0.5% of bone mass per month. In a 6-month ISS mission, an astronaut might lose between 6 and 9% of their bone density in load-bearing skeletal regions. Over 940 days, 31 months, without countermeasures, the math becomes genuinely alarming. Now picture the exercise machines on the ISS. There is a treadmill that uses a harness and bungee cords to press the astronaut toward the belt, because there is no weight pressing them down. There is a resistance machine called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, the ARED, that provides up to 272 kilograms of simulated load through a vacuum cylinder system. Because there are no weights to lift when nothing has weight, there is a cycling ergometer. Together, these machines account for approximately 2.5 hours of structured exercise every single day, of a long-duration mission, not for fitness, not for general health, as medical countermeasures against the specific, quantified ongoing loss of physiological capacity that begins the moment the spacecraft leaves Earth. Even with 2.5 hours of daily exercise, bone loss continues, cardiovascular deconditioning continues, muscle atrophy continues. The countermeasures slow the process. They do not stop it. On a Mars mission, the cargo mass constraints that determine what can be brought on the journey are extraordinary. Every kilogram launched from Earth carries an enormous cost in fuel. and therefore in money and mission complexity. The exercise machines on the ISS, the ARED alone weighs several hundred kilograms, may not make the cut in their current form. Lighter systems are being designed, but lighter systems produce different results. And systems of any kind can break down. On the ISS, a broken exercise machine can be repaired or replaced on a resupply schedule. On a Mars transit, the nearest repair shop is the engineering team on board, working from whatever spare parts the mission brought, in a spacecraft where every component has a mass budget attached to it. For a while, in the early optimistic phases of Mars mission planning, exercise was imagined as the answer, the complete solution. Get the exercise prescription right, and the body's adaptation to microgravity becomes manageable. That picture became more complicated as the data from long-duration ISS missions accumulated, because the cardiovascular system and the bones and the muscles are not the only things that change. There is something else happening, something that took longer to name and longer still to understand, something that happens to the fluid. There is a detail about galactic cosmic rays that doesn't appear in most popular descriptions of the radiation problem, and that changes the picture significantly when you understand it. The shielding materials we use for spacecraft, aluminum primarily, do not simply block galactic cosmic rays the way a wall blocks sound or a lead apron blocks X-rays. At the energies involved, aluminum doesn't have enough stopping power. The HCE particles are too energetic. What the aluminum does when a cosmic ray strikes it is participate in a nuclear interaction. The primary particle fragments into secondary particles, which may themselves fragment, producing a cascade of lower energy particles that spreads outward from the initial interaction point like a shower. The problem is that some of these secondary particles, neutrons, pions, lighter ions, are themselves biologically damaging. They travel in different directions from the original particle. They can reach parts of the crew member's body that the original particle would have missed, and the overall biological dose from the primary plus secondary radiation can, for thick shielding, actually be higher than from the primary particle alone. This is why NASA's radiation shielding research is so difficult, and why the mass of shielding is not a simple lever. Adding more aluminum doesn't linearly reduce the radiation problem. There is an optimum shielding thickness, roughly the amount currently used on the ISS, and adding beyond that optimum for aluminum actually makes some things worse before it makes them better. Different materials, water, polyethylene, liquid hydrogen, have different secondary particle profiles and can be more effective than aluminum for specific components of the galactic cosmic ray spectrum, which is why mission designers consider them. But the mass they require is prohibitive for a spacecraft that has to be launched from Earth's gravity well. This is not an engineering problem with an engineering solution readily available. It is a physics problem that currently has no clean answer. What the astronauts on the Mars transit will be living inside for 940 days is an environment that the physics of radiation shielding cannot fully protect them from. The best available mitigation reduces the dose meaningfully, but does not reduce it to safe levels by NASA's own standards. Now consider what this means alongside the bone loss and the cardiovascular changes. BAS. During the period when the body is losing bone at 1 to 1.5% per month, when the heart is deconditioned, when the immune system is altered, when the microbiome is shifting. During all of that, the DNA in every cell of the crew member's body is being fractured by particles moving at nearly the speed of light. The repair systems that would normally manage this damage are operating inside a body that is simultaneously managing all the other adaptations. The radiation doesn't wait for the other stressors to resolve. The bone loss doesn't pause to let the immune system stabilize. The behavioral stress doesn't defer to the cardiovascular deconditioning. They happen simultaneously, they interact, and the body manages all of them at once, drawing on the same physiological and biochemical reserves for each. This is why the Space Exposome framework is more than an organizational tool. It captures something real about the biological situation. The individual risks, studied in isolation, are serious. The combined reality is something that the sum of the individual risk estimates may understate, because the interactions between them can amplify each other in ways that the additive model doesn't capture. There is one more thing about the radiation that deserves space here, because it connects to something that has received increasing research attention in recent years. Radiation doesn't affect all tissues equally. The tissues most vulnerable to radiation damage are those with the highest rates of cell division: bone marrow, the lining of the gastrointestinal tract, the gonads, the cornea of the eye. These are the tissues where cells need to be replaced most frequently, and where the dividing cells are most exposed to radiation-induced errors during the DNA replication that division requires. Bone marrow is the factory that produces the immune system. Damage the bone marrow, and you damage the output. Fewer immune cells, or immune cells with altered function, or immune cells carrying mutations that may, over years, predispose to blood cancers like leukemia. The radiation-induced bone marrow damage is not separate from the immune system changes documented in spaceflight. It is one of the mechanisms driving them. And the gastrointestinal lining, the constantly dividing cells that face the contents of the gut, the microbiome, the biochemical environment of digestion, is both radiation sensitive and microbiome sensitive. Radiation damages the cells. The altered microbiome changes the biochemical environment those cells are operating in. The nutritional content of the food affects the resources available for repair. All of these things interact in the gut in ways that researchers are still characterizing. The body is a system. Damage in one place propagates. In microgravity, fluid redistributes. On Earth, gravity is a constant force on every fluid in your body: blood, lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, the interstitial fluid that fills the spaces between your cells. All of it is subject to the same downward pull. The result is a distribution that your cardiovascular and lymphatic systems have spent their entire evolutionary history managing. More fluid in the lower extremities when you stand, less when you lie down. Constant, continuous, dynamic regulation that you never consciously think about because it works. Remove gravity, and the distribution changes fundamentally. Within hours of reaching orbit, astronauts notice it. The face becomes puffy. The sinuses feel full. The legs feel lighter, genuinely lighter, not just because they weigh nothing in freefall, but because some of the fluid that normally pools in them has migrated upward through the body. The brain receives slightly more fluid than it normally does. The venous drainage from the head, which relies partly on gravity to help blood and cerebrospinal fluid return toward the heart, slows. On Earth, this situation would resolve quickly. Stand up from a long time lying down and your baroreceptors detect the sudden postural change, adjust heart rate and vascular tone, and restore balance within seconds. But in microgravity, there is no standing up. There is no postural shift. The fluid is simply there, accumulated in the upper body, pressing gently and persistently against every structure it encounters. including the tissue behind the eye. What happens in roughly 69% of American crew members who complete long-duration ISS missions is a process that was not fully understood and not even fully documented until relatively recently. The accumulation of fluid in the upper body creates elevated pressure in the venous system of the head. That elevated pressure propagates through the cerebrospinal fluid pathways, the fluid-filled spaces inside and around the brain and spinal cord, and it finds an exit point, a place where the pressure gradient allows it to express, the space behind the eye. The optic nerve enters the eye through an opening called the optic disc. Around that opening, inside the eye, the retina and its supporting layers are exposed to the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid on the other side. When that pressure rises, the disc swells. The medical term is optic disc edema, swelling of the optic disc. The retina develops wrinkles called chorioretinal folds, where the elevated pressure has physically deformed the tissue. And in some cases, documented, measured, verified cases, the back of the eyeball itself changes shape. It flattens. The axial length of the eye, the distance from the cornea at the front to the retina at the back, shortens. The physical geometry of the eye changes. This syndrome has a name now: spaceflight-associated neuro-ocular syndrome, SANS. It was renamed from an earlier designation, vision impairment intracranial pressure, or VIIP, because research revealed that it was more complex and more wide-ranging than a simple pressure problem. The name SANS was chosen in part because it acknowledges that we are still learning what the syndrome actually is, and because it leaves room for the possibility that the effects extend well beyond the retina and optic nerve. NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson became, in the documentation of SANS, something of a landmark figure, not because her case was the most severe, but because of what it illustrated about the daily reality of space medicine at the frontier of human endurance. During her missions on the ISS, Whitson performed routine optical coherence tomography scans on herself, alone, using a device mounted to the station's medical bay wall, pointing it at her own eye, reading the output, recording the data, and transmitting it to the ophthalmic teams on the ground, who were trying to characterize what was happening to her retinal structure in real time. Her eyes were changing, not in ways that impaired her operationally, not in ways that prevented her from completing her mission duties, but measurably, demonstrably, in ways that persisted after she returned home. The chorioretinal folds documented during her missions did not fully resolve afterward. Years later, they were still there. The long-term risk of SANS, the risk that matters most for a Mars mission, is not the temporary visual disturbance or the inconvenience of needing corrective lenses during flight. It is the possibility that severe or sustained optic disc edema can produce permanent damage to the optic nerve and the retinal nerve fiber layer. Permanent loss of visual function. No such case has yet been documented in any astronaut. But no astronaut has yet spent 940 days in the interplanetary radiation and fluid shift environment of a Mars transit. The benchmark cases don't exist yet, but the version you've heard, if you've read about SANS, tends to focus on the eyes, and the eyes are the most visible and most dramatic expression of the problem. They are not the whole problem, because the same fluid pressure that is reshaping the back of the eyeball is also acting on something else, something that takes longer to image and longer still to interpret. The brain. MRI studies of astronauts before and after long-duration spaceflight have revealed structural changes in the brain that nobody anticipated. After missions of 6 months or longer, The brain physically shifts position inside the skull, upward. The cerebrospinal fluid spaces at the vertex, the top of the head, narrow. The brain, which under normal Earth conditions sits in its fluid cushion, in a condition of near-perfect buoyancy, is being gently, persistently displaced toward the top of the skull by the fluid redistribution of microgravity. The ventricles, the fluid-filled chambers deep inside the brain, enlarge. Multiple independent research groups studying different astronaut cohorts have measured ventricular volume increases in the range of 10 to 15% following long-duration spaceflight. That is not a trivial structural change. It is the brain's internal fluid spaces expanding in response to pressure gradients that gravity normally prevents from existing. As of the current state of the research, no astronaut has been documented to show clinically significant cognitive deficits that can be directly attributed to these structural brain changes. Cognitive testing conducted on board and after return has not revealed consistent, systematic impairments. But the scientists conducting this research are carefully explicit about what that means and what it doesn't mean. It means the tests currently used in astronaut assessment did not detect significant deficits in the specific populations tested at the specific time points measured. It does not mean deficits don't exist. And it does not mean that deficits won't appear at longer mission durations, or in more sensitive assessments, or in longer-term follow-up studies of crews who spent 2.5 years in the interplanetary environment rather than 6 months in low Earth orbit. The clock on this question had been ticking for years before anyone had the imaging technology to see it clearly. The field is still catching up. Now step further inward, smaller than the brain, smaller than any individual cell, into the community of organisms that lives within the body and is, in a very real sense, part of the body. The microbiome. Your body contains approximately 37 trillion human cells. It also hosts a roughly comparable number of microbial cells, bacteria, fungi, archaea, and viruses that live in your gut, on your skin, in your mouth and airways, and in dozens of other niches throughout the body. These are not parasites or invaders that your immune system tolerates under sufferance. They are partners, co-evolutionary participants in the biology of a human life. They digest food your cells cannot digest. They produce compounds, vitamins, neurotransmitters, anti-inflammatory signals that your biology has come to rely on. They train and calibrate your immune system. They occupy ecological niches that would otherwise be available to pathogens. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication network between the enteric nervous system of the gut and the central nervous system of the brain, mediated partly through the vagus nerve and partly through the immune system and the bloodstream, is one of the most active current research areas in neuroscience and psychiatry. The microbiome influences mood, cognition, stress response, and aspects of behavior in ways that are still being mapped. It is not a peripheral system. In microgravity, the microbiome changes. The exact nature of the changes, their direction, their clinical significance, their interaction with the other physiological changes of spaceflight. All of this is active research with incomplete answers. But in 2006, researchers studying bacteria cultivated aboard Space Shuttle Atlantis during mission STS-115 found something that grounded the concern in hard specific evidence. Salmonella typhimurium, a bacterium that causes food poisoning and in immunocompromised individuals potentially life-threatening infection, was grown aboard the shuttle and then tested in mouse studies after the mission. the space-cultivated bacteria were significantly more virulent than bacteria grown under identical conditions on the ground. More of the mice exposed to the space-grown salmonella died, and they died faster. The mechanism appears to involve the low fluid shear environment of microgravity. On Earth, bacteria in liquid environments experience constant mechanical forces from fluid movement, shear forces that their gene regulation systems use as environmental signals. In microgravity, those forces are absent, and at least in Salmonella, the absence of those forces triggers changes in gene expression that upregulate virulence factors, the biological tools that make a bacterium more dangerous to its host. The implication is not that every pathogen in space becomes more dangerous. The implication is that some might, and that the crew members most exposed to those potentially more dangerous pathogens will be crew members whose immune systems have been simultaneously altered by radiation, fluid shifts, sleep disruption, psychological stress, altered nutrition, and the accumulated physiological burden of months or years in an environment their biology was not built for. NASA's own systematic review has documented more than 30 distinct changes in immune function associated with spaceflight. The distribution of immune cell types shifts. The activity of natural killer cells, the immune system's first responders against viral infection and some cancers, changes. Latent viral infections, including herpes viruses that most adults carry dormant in their nervous systems, reactivate at higher rates in astronauts than in matched controls on the ground. The immune system that would normally suppress these latent infections is, in the spaceflight environment, slightly less capable of doing so, and the radiation is doing its own damage to the immune system in parallel. HZE particles damage the rapidly dividing cells of the bone marrow, the factory that produces the immune cells circulating in the bloodstream, at rates that add a radiation-induced immune suppression on top of the microgravity-induced changes. These are not independent problems. They are a system of interacting, compounding vulnerabilities in a body that was not designed for this environment and is responding with everything it has to conditions that it has no evolutionary preparation for. There is a question that sits at the far edge of all of this, not a medical question, a cosmological one. But it connects to the biology in a way that feels, once you've spent time with the data, less like philosophy and more like pattern recognition. It's called the Great Filter. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Our galaxy contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Conservative estimates suggest tens of billions of potentially habitable planets in the Milky Way alone. The conditions for the chemistry of life, carbon, water, moderate temperatures, liquid solvents, exist at scales that are difficult to intuit. And the universe has had 13.8 billion years for life to emerge, evolve, develop intelligence, develop technology, and begin expanding. And yet, 60 years of searching the sky with radio telescopes, 60 years of looking for signals, for structures, for any evidence of intelligence operating at scales we would recognize. And nothing. Silence. The Great Silence, as astronomer David Brin named it. In 1950, Enrico Fermi gave voice to the question that this silence demands. If the math suggests they should be there, if the sheer size and age of the universe means that civilizations should have had time to emerge and spread, where are they? Robin Hanson gave the question a framework in 1998, the Great Filter, the idea that somewhere between the emergence of simple chemistry and the achievement of galactic-scale civilization, there is a step, possibly one, possibly several, that is extraordinarily improbable. a filter that destroys or prevents the vast majority of would-be civilizations before they get through. And the question that haunts the framework is, are we before the filter or after it? If the filter is behind us, if the unlikely step was something in our past, like the origin of life, or the emergence of eukaryotic cells, or the development of sexual reproduction, then we might be among the rare ones who made it through, and the future is open. If the filter is ahead of us, if something eliminates technologically capable civilizations before they achieve permanence, then the silence of the universe is not evidence of our rarity. It is a warning. Now consider the biology we've spent the last hour walking through. Consider what it means that a species shaped by billions of years of evolution on one world, tuned to the exact gravity and magnetic field and radiation environment and atmospheric pressure of that world, finds that its cells and bones and eyes and brains and immune systems begin failing when removed from those conditions. What if the great filter is not a nuclear war, not an engineered pathogen, not a climate catastrophe or an asteroid impact or any of the dramatic extinction scenarios that science fiction has explored? What if it is simply this, that life, wherever it emerges, is so precisely and completely shaped by the world that made it that it cannot survive the crossing to another world, that the universe is full of life, beautiful, complex, intelligent life, and all of it is anchored, all of it tethered to the narrow envelope of the home planet, unable to persist long enough in the void between worlds to reach the next one? That is not a comforting thought, but it is, in the quiet of tonight, worth sitting with. Let's stay with the fluid problem for a moment longer, because there is a dimension to it that tends to get overlooked in the conversation about SANS and brain shifts. The cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that fills the spaces around the brain and spinal cord, is not just a cushion. It is an active transport system. It carries nutrients to the brain. It carries waste products away from the brain. The clearance of metabolic waste from the brain, including the proteins associated with neurodegenerative disease, happens largely through the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, through a system of channels around and between neurons that researchers discovered relatively recently and named the glymphatic system. The glymphatic system is most active during sleep. During sleep, the spaces between neurons in the brain actually expand slightly, and cerebrospinal fluid flows through them more freely, washing away the biochemical debris of waking activity. It is one of the reasons that sleep deprivation has such dramatic cognitive consequences, and it is one of the reasons that the consistent sleep disruption documented in ISS crews, arising from the artificial light environment, the noise levels of the station's life support systems, the scheduled demands of mission operations, the circadian disruption, is more than just a quality of life issue. If sleep is disrupted, glymphatic clearance is disrupted. If glymphatic clearance is disrupted, metabolic waste accumulates in the brain tissue over time. The proteins that accumulate are, in some cases, the same proteins that characterize Alzheimer's disease, the same proteins whose deposition is accelerated in animal models by HZE radiation exposure. These are separate mechanisms converging on the same outcome. And then there is the cerebrospinal fluid circulation itself. In microgravity, the fluid distribution changes in ways that may alter the normal flow patterns through the glymphatic channels. If the fluid is under elevated pressure due to the headward fluid shift, if the channels are mechanically altered by the brain's displacement within the skull, the clearance function may be compromised independently of sleep quality. This is the kind of interaction that makes space medicine research difficult and humbling. you are not dealing with one problem at a time. You are dealing with a system of problems that share mechanisms, share substrates, and affect the same biological outcomes through different pathways simultaneously. The SANS research gives a specific and concrete example of where good science has made progress, but it also illustrates how long the path from observation to mechanism to intervention can be. SANS, or what was then called ZIP, was first recognized as a distinct clinical entity around 2010, when astronauts began reporting vision changes and ophthalmic examinations revealed the characteristic signs. It took years of research to establish the syndrome definitively, to distinguish it from normal variation, to begin characterizing the mechanisms. The one-carbon pathway genetic association, the finding that variants in specific genes related to B vitamin metabolism predict SANS severity, was a significant step forward. But even that finding, robust and replicated, still leaves open questions. Is homocysteine itself the mediating molecule, or is it a marker for some other aspect of the one-carbon pathway's dysfunction? Exactly what structural changes does it produce in the relevant tissues? Does B vitamin supplementation actually prevent the SANS changes, or only attenuate them, or only in the most genetically susceptible individuals? These questions are being answered carefully, incrementally, in study populations that are small because there aren't many people who go to space. And in the meantime, crews are going to space and developing SANS at rates of 69% and returning home with eye changes that have been documented to persist for years. Now move to the scale of what this means for Mars. Not 6 months in low Earth orbit, where resupply ships arrive, where the crew rotates, where the option of medical evacuation exists if something serious happens. 30 months in interplanetary space, where the crew that leaves is the crew that arrives, where the medical resources are whatever was packed, where the Earth is a point of light indistinguishable from the other points of light, except by its brightness and color. The fluid shifts that produce the SANS in 6 months will continue for 30, whether the severity increases linearly, or plateaus, or accelerates due to some mechanism that doesn't appear in the 6-month data, is genuinely unknown. No human has spent 30 months in microgravity. The data doesn't exist. The great filter question sits here as much as it sits anywhere, not as a dramatic extinction scenario, but as a quiet biological arithmetic. Every cell in the body is adapted to Earth. Remove it from Earth for long enough, and the adaptation starts producing outputs that Earth never prepared it for. The filter is not catastrophic, it is gradual. It is the bone that thins, and the eye that reshapes, and the brain that shifts, and the immune system that changes. None of them fatal individually, all of them together constituting a cumulative biological burden whose long-term trajectory over mission-relevant timescales we do not yet have the data to fully characterize. That is an honest accounting of where the science stands. We have been talking about the physical body, about bones and radiation and eyes and cerebrospinal fluid, and the molecular biology of immune suppression. These are things that can be measured, graphed, published, and in principle addressed with the right countermeasures. But there is another layer to what the interplanetary environment does to a person, and it does not appear on any MRI or blood panel or bone density scan. It appears in the diary entries that astronauts write in the 3rd month, in the patterns in the data from isolation studies, in the carefully neutral language of behavioral medicine risk assessments that, once you learn to read them, are saying something quite stark. In June of 2010, 6 volunteers entered a sealed isolation facility at the Institute for Biomedical Problems in Moscow, Russia. 3 Russian cosmonauts, 2 European astronauts, and 1 Chinese researcher. They closed the hatch behind them, and they didn't open it again for 520 days. The Mars 500 study, the most comprehensive simulation of a crewed Mars mission ever conducted, at least in terms of duration and psychological conditions. No weightlessness, the facility was on the ground. No actual radiation exposure beyond normal background. No real operational crises that couldn't be managed from outside. Just isolation, confinement, simulated communication delays, simulated mission operations. 6 people in a facility that totaled about 550 cubic meters of habitable volume, roughly the size of a large apartment, for a year and a half. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains something important. Of the 6 crew members, 1 experienced symptoms consistent with clinical depression, as measured by the Beck Depression Inventory, during 93% of mission weeks. During more than 10% of those weeks, the symptoms reached mild to moderate clinical thresholds. 2 crew members showed significant dysregulation of their circadian rhythms. Their sleep-wake cycles drifted and fragmented in ways that had measurable effects on their performance and mood. And 2 crew members, out of 6, accounted for 85% of all perceived interpersonal conflicts during the entire 520-day study. 85% of the friction, the tension, the moments that wore on crew cohesion and individual well-being came from 2 people, not because those 2 people were difficult or unstable or poorly selected, because the data from extended isolation consistently shows that sustained confinement, sustained stress, sustained social friction without relief produces a narrowing of psychological reserves. And when reserves narrow far enough, small things become large things. A difference in tidiness standards becomes a source of genuine resentment. A disagreement about procedure becomes a conflict about values. The social work of living together in a small space, which is normally invisible because people can step away from each other, becomes constant and unavoidable and exhausting. On a real Mars mission, there is no end of study. There is no hatch that opens after 520 days. There is no option to decide that the experiment has run long enough and decompress the facility. For the actual crew of a Mars mission, the facility is the spacecraft, and the spacecraft is the only survivable environment within hundreds of millions of kilometers, and the mission continues on its own timeline, regardless of what is happening to the people inside. The communication delay compounds everything. Earth and Mars are separated by distances that vary enormously as they orbit the Sun, but the one-way communication delay ranges from about 3 minutes at closest approach to about 22 minutes at their farthest. On a mission that departs during a favorable orbital window and spends its transit phase in interplanetary space, the delay for most of the mission will be in the range of 10 to 20 minutes each way. 20 minutes to send a message, 20 minutes for it to arrive, 20 minutes for a response to travel back, 40 minutes minimum for a question and an answer in a medical emergency, in a moment of acute psychological crisis, in any situation where real-time human contact with Earth would provide the kind of support that makes a difference. That is not a support network. It is a postal service, and it is the only connection to everything outside the spacecraft that exists. NASA's Human Research Program has been collecting and analyzing astronaut journal entries from the ISS for years. The journal study, associated with behavioral researcher Jack Stuster, represents one of the most systematic attempts to look inside the psychological experience of long-duration spaceflight, not through questionnaires or formal assessments, but through the unfiltered daily writing of people living through it. The pattern that emerges from that data is consistent across multiple crews and multiple missions. A temporal arc. Not smooth, not monotonic, but with a shape that repeats. The first quarter of the mission carries the energy of novelty, the stimulation of being somewhere extraordinary, the focus and purpose of a new and demanding environment. People are alert, engaged, coping well. The second quarter settles into the rhythm of work. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The tasks become routine. Adaptation is happening, which is good. But with adaptation comes a kind of flatness. The remarkable aspects of the situation become background. The third quarter. This is where the pattern sharpens. Past the halfway point, still far from the end, the weight of how long it has already been starts to accumulate. Negative comments in journal entries increase relative to positive ones. Morale indicators dip. What researchers have called the third quarter phenomenon emerges, a consistent cross-mission pattern of increased psychological difficulty in the portions of the mission that is farthest from both the beginning and the end. On a 6-month ISS mission, the third quarter is the 4th and 5th month. On a 940-day Mars mission, the third quarter begins somewhere around month 15 and extends into month 22. It lasts longer than most ISS missions. NASA's formal classification of behavioral health as a red risk for planetary missions, the behavioral medicine risk, listed alongside radiation and SANS as among the highest priority threats, is rooted in exactly this data. Not in theory, in the documented patterns from every long-duration spaceflight study conducted in the past 60 years. The likelihood is assessed as high. The consequence ranges from moderate performance decrements to, in the least likely but most serious scenarios, the development of frank psychiatric illness in a crew member who is sealed in a spacecraft with 5 other people and no possibility of evacuation or external intervention. Think about what that actually means, translated out of risk matrix language into human terms. A member of a Mars crew develops a condition that, on Earth, would be treated with hospitalization, medication adjustment, intensive support, removal from the stressful environment. On a Mars mission, the stressful environment is inescapable. The crew becomes both the support network and the source of the stress. The communication delay means that any guidance from mental health professionals on Earth arrives in 40-minute intervals as written messages, which is not the same as care. The crew that goes to Mars will need to be capable of managing this. And no amount of screening and selection and pre-mission training can eliminate the biological reality that extended isolation and confinement produces psychological changes in virtually all humans who experience it long enough. One of the things that research in Antarctic overwinter stations, which serve as some of the better Earth-based analogues for the isolation and confinement of interplanetary space, has revealed is that the psychological demands of sustained isolation are not primarily about dramatic crises. They are about the accumulation of small things, the absence of fresh air, the absence of natural light that changes with weather and season, the absence of new faces, the absence of the option to be alone when you need to be alone, or to be with people when you need people. Because in a crew of 6 in a spacecraft, your options in both directions are fixed. Think about Peggy Whitson conducting her own eye screenings in orbit. The clinical precision of it, the discipline of performing a medical assessment on yourself in an environment where medical resources are limited and the consequences of missing something are potentially serious. That is a psychological performance as much as a physical one. The ability to maintain that level of function, that level of professional composure, across months and years in an environment that is working steadily against your physiology, is extraordinary. And it is the standard that every member of a Mars crew will be held to. On the ground, at NASA's Johnson Space Center, nutritional biochemist Scott Smith and his team approach the problem from a different angle. They are working on the food, not in the sense of making it taste better, though that matters too. In the sense of understanding that every meal on a Mars mission is a pharmacological intervention, the acidogenic potential of the space diet, a technical term for the degree to which the chemical properties of the food consumed shift the body's acid-base balance in a direction that accelerates bone resorption, turns out to be one of the underappreciated drivers of the bone loss problem. High sodium content in the diet, which is common in processed and preserved space food, increases the acid load on the body. That acid load is buffered partly by calcium released from bone. More acid load, more calcium released, more bone lost. Smith's team found that the acidogenic potential of what astronauts actually ate during ISS missions correlated directly and measurably with their post-flight bone density losses. The food was contributing to the skeletal deterioration that the exercise machines were fighting. Simultaneously, the nutritional content of the food was affecting not just bone, but immune function, cardiovascular health, cognitive performance, and several of the pathways implicated in SANS. The irony is layered and a little uncomfortable. The same biological sophistication that drove billions of years of successful adaptation is now adapting itself right out of the conditions it needs. The body is optimizing for a world that, the moment the mission ends, will no longer exist, and every system involved in that optimization, the cardiovascular system, the skeletal system, the immune system, the microbiome, will then need to reverse course and readapt to the world it came from, which is itself a process that takes months and is not without its own medical risks. There is a quality of time in isolated environments that is qualitatively different from time on the outside. People who have experienced it, Antarctic overwinter cruise, submarine deployments, the participants in extended isolation studies, describe it consistently, with variations in language that converge on the same underlying experience. Time slows and also accelerates simultaneously. Days become routine to the point of invisibility, and months pass without the markers that normally give time shape. And the sense of duration, of how long you have been in this place, of how much longer it will continue, becomes a weight that accumulates differently from anything that ordinary daily life prepares you for. On a 6-month ISS mission, this is managed partly by the structure of the mission itself, partly by the relatively frequent arrival of new vehicles and new faces during resupply and crew rotation visits, and partly by the communication with Earth that remains essentially real-time for most of the mission. A video call home takes a few hundred milliseconds of latency. Text messages arrive immediately. The crew members are isolated in space but connected to their lives on the ground in ways that matter. On a Mars transit, this changes. The communication delay begins to accumulate from the moment of departure. By the time the crew has been in space for a month, the delay is already several minutes each way. By the 3rd month, it may be 10 to 15 minutes. By the time they reach Mars, 20 minutes or more. The texture of communication changes profoundly. A conversation cannot happen. Only an exchange of prepared statements, sent and received in intervals that are too long for the spontaneous human contact that normally sustains relationships. A crew member who is struggling, who is in the third quarter dip, who is tired and isolated and irritated and not sleeping well, and experiencing the subtle cognitive changes that come from months of altered physiology, can't call their partner and hear a reassuring voice and feel immediately better. They can send a message. They can receive a message back 40 minutes later or more, composed by someone on Earth who didn't hear the emotional state in the original message, but only read words on a screen. The crew member who is struggling is also, simultaneously, the person who has to operate the spacecraft, who has to conduct the scientific program, who has to maintain the mechanical and life support systems, who has to be a functioning member of a small social group in a confined space where every interpersonal dynamic is visible and inescapable. The Antarctic research offers one set of reference points. Crews of between 12 and 40 people, wintering over for 8 months at research stations in conditions of extreme cold, prolonged darkness, and operational isolation, have been studied extensively for their psychological responses. The picture that emerges is not one of dramatic breakdown. It is one of gradual attrition. Sleep becomes more difficult. Mood indicators drift downward. Irritability increases. Cognitive performance on certain task types declines measurably. Interpersonal friction accumulates. The social fabric of the group, which everyone depends on and which everyone is simultaneously straining, requires constant and conscious maintenance that becomes progressively more effortful. Now scale that to 6 people. Now extend it to 30 months. Now remove even the option of the resupply flights that at least bring new faces and fresh food to Antarctic stations. Now add the physiological burden of radiation and bone loss, and altered immune function, and disrupted sleep from a circadian system that has no Earth-normal light cycle to entrain to. Now add the knowledge that if something goes seriously wrong, medically, mechanically, interpersonally, the nearest help is measured in light minutes, and the nearest evacuation option does not exist. The behavioral medicine risk classification is red, the same category as radiation carcinogenesis, the same category as SANS, is not overcautious. It is grounded in exactly this calculation. The probability that some adverse behavioral or psychological outcome occurs over 30 months in those conditions in a crew of 6 is not vanishingly small. The probability that it occurs without any impact on mission performance, crew safety, or individual health is smaller still. What this means practically for mission design is that the psychological architecture of the mission needs to receive the same engineering attention as the propulsion system and the life support, the design of crew spaces that provide genuine privacy, the selection of crew compositions that have demonstrated sustained cohesion under stress, not just individual resilience, the development of behavioral health monitoring tools that can detect the early signatures of psychological decline before it becomes operationally significant, the creation of communication tools and protocols that make the best possible use of the delayed connection with Earth, rather than treating it as a limitation to be accepted and worked around. These things are being designed. They are part of the mission architecture for the Mars programs currently being developed. And they are genuinely hard design problems because the behavioral and psychological needs of the crew exist in tension with every other constraint. Mass, power, volume, schedule, cost that the mission designer has to manage. The person who goes to Mars will need to carry their psychological health with them the way they carry their oxygen supply, not as something external and supplemental, but as a fundamental operational capacity that the mission depends on, and that requires the same careful stewardship as every other system on board. The Artemis II crew entered their pre-mission quarantine in March 2026. 4 astronauts, the first human beings to travel beyond low Earth orbit since Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt, left the lunar surface in December of 1972. The science of what happens to the human body in space has advanced immeasurably since 1972. In 1972, we had no MRI data on spaceflight-related brain changes, no documented cases of SANS, no understanding of the microbiome's relationship to immune function, no systematic behavioral medicine risk framework, no concept of the space exposome, no molecular biology of radiation-induced DNA damage in HZE environments. Now we have all of that, and the picture it draws is more detailed and in some respects, more challenging than anything the Apollo-era scientists were working with. The good news is that NASA's Human Research Program knows more precisely what the problems are. The complicated news is that knowing what the problems are and having solutions ready for a 940-day Mars mission are not the same thing. The approach that has emerged from the past decade of space medicine research is personalization, not one-size-fits-all countermeasures. Individual biological profiles applied to individual risk predictions, generating individual mitigation strategies. The SANS research illustrates why this matters. Not every astronaut develops the same degree of ocular change in the same amount of time. Some show significant optic disc edema within weeks of reaching orbit. Some complete 6-month ISS missions with minimal measured change. Some fall somewhere between. For years, nobody understood why the variability existed, or whether it was predictable, or whether it could be used to identify crew members who needed more aggressive monitoring or prophylactic intervention. The answer came from a collaboration between NASA's Nutritional Biochemistry Group, ophthalmic researchers, and geneticists. It turned out to involve a set of single nucleotide polymorphisms, individual variations in the DNA sequence, in genes that regulate what is called the one-carbon metabolic pathway. This is a biochemical network centered on folate and several B vitamins, and its outputs include the synthesis of DNA, the regulation of gene expression through methylation, and the production of homocysteine, a small molecule that, when elevated, is a marker for inflammation and endothelial dysfunction. Astronauts who developed more severe SANS-related eye changes tended to have higher levels of homocysteine before they flew. They tended to carry specific genetic variants in the one-carbon pathway genes that altered the efficiency of B vitamin metabolism. And the combination of those pre-existing biochemical vulnerabilities with the fluid shifts of microgravity appeared to be what pushed their ocular anatomy toward the changes that SANS describes. The intervention that this finding points toward is, in principle, elegantly simple. Targeted B vitamin supplementation before and during flight, adjusted to individual genetic and metabolic profiles to reduce homocysteine and support the one-carbon pathway. Whether this intervention works at scale and over mission durations longer than 6 months remains to be demonstrated, but the identification of the mechanism represents exactly what personalized space medicine looks like when it is working. You find the mechanism, you find the biomarker, you find the countermeasure, you test it rigorously, you deploy it with individual tailoring. The challenge is that the one-carbon SANS pathway took roughly 15 years to fully characterize from first observation, to proposed mechanism, to genetic association, to clinical implication. And there are more than 30 documented risk categories in the Human Research Program, each requiring the same depth of investigation. In a study population, all humans who have ever been to space, that totals approximately 630 people across all of human spaceflight history. The pace of the science is set by the pace at which humans can be sent to space, which is limited by cost, by vehicle availability, by mission design, and by the physical limits of how much research can be conducted in a 6-month ISS tour without overwhelming the crew's primary mission objectives. While the ESAN's research was building toward its current understanding, a different approach was developing on the computational side of space medicine. Scientists began working on digital twins, not a simulation in the science fiction sense, not a digital avatar or a virtual reality representation. A computational model constructed from a specific individual's molecular profile, their genome, their proteome, their metabolome, their microbiome, along with their physiological baseline measurements, their medical history, and everything the literature knows about how those variables interact with the spaceflight environment. The goal of a digital twin is predictive. You construct the model from the data that exists before the mission. You then simulate the physiological trajectory of that specific individual through the specific conditions of the planned mission, the radiation environment, the microgravity, duration, the dietary parameters, the exercise prescription, the psychological stresses, and you use that simulation to identify, in advance, where the individual is likely to be vulnerable, which risks are most elevated for this person given their specific biology, which countermeasures are most likely to be effective, where monitoring should be most intensive. This is the Space Exposome applied at the level of the individual, using systems biology as the methodology and computational modeling as the tool. It is not yet operational. The models are not yet validated against Mars mission duration data, because that data doesn't exist. But the research infrastructure for it is being built, and the concept represents the direction that space medicine is heading. And then there is the harder question, the one that sits at the far end of the countermeasures discussion, the one that researchers approach in the language of ethics and frameworks and paradigm shifts, rather than the language of clinical trials and dosing protocols. What if the body, as it currently exists, cannot be made adequate for the mission through countermeasures alone? The radiation morbidity projections for a 940-day Mars mission, morbidity approaching 20% at the upper confidence bound, represent a number that shielding cannot solve with current materials and current launch capabilities. The massive shielding required to reduce galactic cosmic ray flux to near-Earth levels would be prohibitive. Water and hydrocarbon materials, which are more effective than aluminum for cosmic ray shielding, provide only modest additional protection, perhaps 10% better, for the shielding masses that are actually achievable on a Mars mission. Pharmacological countermeasures against radiation, antioxidants, radioprotective compounds, work primarily against the acute effects of high-dose, low-let radiation. Their efficacy against the chronic, low-dose, high-let exposure of galactic cosmic rays in deep space is much less established and, based on the known mechanisms of HZE damage, possibly much less effective, which leaves the question that a 2019 research paper examining what it called a potential paradigm shift in human spaceflight posed explicitly. Could gene editing tools like CRISPR-Cas9 be used to modify the fundamental biology of the astronaut, to alter the DNA repair pathways, or the radiation resistance mechanisms, or the bone remodeling regulation, in ways that make the body more compatible with the interplanetary environment? The technical foundations for such an intervention are not wholly absent. The mechanisms of HZE-induced DNA damage are known. the genes that regulate DNA repair are characterized. Specific genetic variants associated with greater radiation resistance have been identified in human populations. The CRISPR system can, in principle, edit those variants into the genome of a person who doesn't carry them naturally. What is not known, what is, in current understanding, fundamentally unknowable without extensive research that doesn't yet exist, is what else changes when you alter those pathways. The genome is not a collection of independent modules. The genes that regulate DNA repair are connected to the genes that regulate cell cycle progression, which are connected to the tumor suppressor pathways, which regulate apoptosis. Improving DNA repair efficiency might, paradoxically, reduce the efficiency of the cell death programs that prevent damaged cells from becoming cancerous. The downstream consequences of any given genetic modification in a system as complex as human biology are not predictable from first principles. These are not objections designed to make the idea seem impossible. They are the actual scientific challenges. They are the reasons that every serious researcher who discusses genetic modification for spaceflight wraps the discussion in words like careful, incremental, evidence-based, and extensively validated. And they are the reasons that such interventions, if they ever become real, will require research timelines measured in decades rather than years. But the conversation is happening. At serious scientific institutions, in peer-reviewed literature, in the program planning documents of the agencies considering how to send people to Mars before the end of this century, we are at the very beginning of a discussion about whether the mission requires a different version of the human being. That is not a sentence that has ever been written in a serious scientific context before in human history. It is being written now. There is also the operational layer. Even setting aside radiation and bone and fluid, shifts and behavioral health, even if every one of those problems were solved tomorrow, the Mars crew would still face a challenge that has no clean technological solution yet. Human fine motor skills degrade in space. The neuromuscular system adapts to microgravity in ways that affect the precision, the steadiness, and the spatial calibration of hand movements. The vestibular system, the fluid-filled chambers of the inner ear that provide balance and spatial orientation, is disturbed by microgravity in ways that affect not just balance, but the integration between visual and proprioceptive signals that underlies precise manual task performance. On a Mars mission, the crew will need to perform emergency surgical procedures, not may need to, will need to, over the course of a 940-day mission, because the statistical certainty that one or more crew members will experience a medical emergency requiring surgical intervention is essentially absolute. A kidney stone that cannot pass, an appendicitis, a traumatic injury during a surface EVA, a dental abscess that reaches the sinuses. On Earth, these things are managed by specialists in environments designed for the purpose. On a Mars mission, they will be managed by the crew member with the most relevant training in the spacecraft's medical bay, with the medical supplies that mission planning determined were worth their mass allocation, with no ability to call for backup that can reach them within any useful time frame. The response to this operational reality is the development of AI-assisted surgical guidance systems and semi-autonomous robotic surgical platforms. Systems that can help a crew member with field medicine training perform procedures that would normally require a surgeon, guided by AI that integrates real-time imaging, procedural databases, and adaptive decision support. These systems are being designed. Some exist in early forms for terrestrial surgical settings. Their adaptation for the mass-limited, power-limited, vibration-present, sterility-challenging environment of a deep space habitat is an active engineering program. We are building machines to save us from ourselves. Not because humans are inadequate in any absolute sense, because humans, in the specific environment of interplanetary space, have limitations that are real and documented and significant. And the gap between those limitations and what the mission requires is currently being filled, carefully and painstakingly, by technology that in some cases has not yet been fully invented. One of the less discussed dimensions of the Mars mission challenge is what mission planners call the autonomous medical care problem. It can be summarized simply, though its implications are not simple at all. On an ISS mission, if a crew member develops a serious medical condition, a cardiac event, an appendicitis, a severe trauma, the mission can be ended. The crew member can be evacuated in the Soyuz or Dragon vehicle, docked to the station, and returned to Earth within hours. Ground-based medical teams can provide real-time guidance. Surgical intervention is available at hospitals within reach. On a Mars mission, none of those options exist. The mission cannot be ended at will. There is no evacuation vehicle. Ground-based guidance arrives in 40-minute intervals and cannot be real-time. The only medical care available is the care that the crew can provide for itself, with the supplies it brought and the training its members received before departure. This is not a hypothetical concern. The statistical reality of a crew of 6 people spending 940 days in an environment with elevated radiation, microgravity-induced physiological changes, disrupted immune function, limited medical resources, and the physical demands of surface operations is that some medical events will occur. The question is not whether, but which ones, when, and how severe. The medical training for Mars crew members will need to be qualitatively different from what ISS crews currently receive. Not a medical kit and a manual and a physician on the ground available to consult. Something approaching the clinical competence to assess and manage complex medical situations with delayed external guidance, limited diagnostic equipment, and constrained treatment options. That is a different kind of training. It requires different selection criteria. It adds another layer of demand on the crew members who are already carrying the physiological and psychological burden of the mission. The artificial intelligence piece connects here. If a crew member needs to perform a procedure that requires surgical precision, suturing a deep wound, draining an abscess, managing a cardiac arrhythmia, treating a bone fracture from a surface EVA accident, AI-assisted guidance can extend what is possible. Systems that integrate real-time imaging from compact ultrasound and optical devices with procedural knowledge bases and decision support algorithms can help a crew member with field medicine training perform procedures that would normally require specialist training. These systems are not fully developed yet. The research programs building them are working against a timeline set by when the missions will fly, not when the science is ready. And there is a fundamental tension in the design. The systems need to be capable enough to be genuinely helpful in complex situations, simple enough to be operated by someone who is not a software engineer, reliable enough to function without maintenance or software updates for the duration of the mission, and compact and light enough to fit within the mission's mass budget. That is a demanding specification. It is being worked on, but it is not finished. The nutritional dimension of the autonomous medical care problem is perhaps less dramatic, but equally important. The food that the crew eats for 940 days will not be fresh. It will be processed, preserved, packaged for shelf stability across a multi-year mission, The nutritional content of processed food degrades over time. Vitamins break down. The phytochemicals and antioxidants that fresh food provides are absent. The diversity of the diet is constrained by the mass and volume budget. Scott Smith's research at NASA's Johnson Space Center has established that the nutritional composition of the diet directly affects multiple risk categories simultaneously. Bone health, through the acid load of the diet, immune function through micronutrient availability, cardiovascular health through sodium and fat composition, and SANS risk through the B vitamin and 1-carbon pathway status. Getting the diet right for a Mars mission is therefore not a comfort issue or a morale issue, though it is both of those things. It is a medical countermeasures issue. The food is the pharmacology, and on a mission where the crew cannot stop at a store, cannot receive a resupply of fresh produce, cannot supplement their diet from any external source for 30 months, the pharmacology has to be right from the start. Pre-packaged, pre-calculated, nutritionally adequate across the entire range of physiological demands that the mission will generate. This is being worked on. The NASA Nutritional Biochemistry Lab has spent decades developing this science. The Mars Food System Design is an active research and engineering program. But the challenge of maintaining nutritional adequacy in a long-duration space food system, against the degradation of nutrients over time, against the caloric demands of physically active crew members in a reduced gravity environment, against the palatability requirements of food that has to be eaten every day for 30 months without the variety that normal Earth life provides, is genuinely difficult. People stop eating food they don't want to eat. Mass loss during spaceflight has been documented consistently across ISS missions, even when the food system is carefully designed and monitored. Crew members who lose body mass during spaceflight lose more bone density and show worse cardiovascular outcomes than those who maintain their mass. The nutrition problem cascades directly into the bone problem and the cardiovascular problem. All of this, the surgical AI, the food system, the behavioral support architecture, the radiation countermeasures, the bone loss countermeasures, the SANS monitoring and intervention, the autonomous medical capability, needs to work simultaneously, reliably, for 30 months, in a system that cannot be updated or repaired from the outside, and that carries everything it will ever need from the moment it leaves Earth. That is what a Mars mission actually is, at the biological level, not an adventure, not an exploration in the romantic sense. A sustained, highly engineered, carefully monitored attempt to keep a collection of biological systems functioning outside the environment those systems were built for long enough to complete a specific set of objectives and return to the world they came from. The people who will do it are remarkable. The engineering required to support them is extraordinary. The science that is building that engineering is genuine and rigorous and advancing. And the problem is still real. Let's zoom all the way out, past the engineering challenges, past the medical protocols, past the specific risks, and the specific countermeasures, and the specific timelines, and the specific budgets, all the way to the question that sits behind all of them. We started tonight with a simple question: can a human being survive deep space? And we've moved, slowly and carefully, through the answer that current science offers. The radiation that travels from supernova explosions across millions of light years and passes through spacecraft walls without pausing, leaving complex, clustered DNA damage in its wake that the cell's repair machinery has no protocol for handling. The fluid that shifts upward in the absence of gravity and presses on the back of the eye and nudges the brain toward the top of the skull. The bone that recalculates its density based on a mechanical signal that microgravity removes and finds, after months of recalculation, that it has dissolved a significant percentage of itself, the immune system that changes in ways that make it less capable of managing the pathogens that may be becoming more capable. The mind that has been alone with the same small group for so long that the absence of relief has become a physiological event. These are not hypotheticals. They are documented. They are measured. They are happening to real people who go to space right now in the relatively protected environment of low Earth orbit, inside the partial shelter of the Earth's magnetic field. The question of what they become over 30 months, in interplanetary space beyond the magnetosphere with no possibility of return, is genuinely open. Scientists have begun organizing this collection of interconnected vulnerabilities under a concept called the space intergrome. Not just the exposome, the sum of external hazards, but the intergrome, the recognition that every human biological system is woven together with every other through feedback loops and signaling pathways and shared substrates that were calibrated over the entire arc of biological history on this planet to operate inside one specific set of conditions. The bone system and the cardiovascular system are not separate. Bone marrow produces the blood cells that carry oxygen to the heart that pumps blood to the bone. The immune system and the microbiome are not separate. The microbiome trains the immune system that modulates the inflammation that affects the integrity of the blood-brain barrier that determines what reaches the neurons of the brain. The brain and the behavioral system and the social functioning of the crew are not separate. They are one continuous system of feedback and regulation, and every loop in that system depends on conditions that the interplanetary environment systematically disrupts. What evolution built isn't fixed, in the sense that it has changed before and will change again. The body has demonstrated repeatedly and dramatically across the history of life that it can adapt to new pressures over time. The problem is the timescale. Meaningful biological adaptation through natural selection takes not years or decades, but thousands of generations. The Mars missions being planned for this century will happen within a single human lifetime. The bodies that board those spacecraft will be the same bodies that stood on Earth and looked up at the sky and wanted to go there. Inside an imagined spacecraft, somewhere in the transit between Earth and Mars, all of it is happening simultaneously. The bones are recalibrating. The immune cells are shifting their distribution. The fluid is pressing on the tissue behind the eye. The microbiome is adapting to recycled air and processed food, and the microbial monoculture of a sealed system. The brain is maintaining its function, its focus, its professional performance against the steady background of changes in its structural environment. And the person inside all of that biology is keeping a log and doing their work, and occasionally, in quiet moments, in the cupola window equivalent, looking at the void, thinking about how far they are from everything. The great filter question is still there. The possibility that life is common and interstellar civilization is absent, not because civilizations destroy themselves, but because the biology of any given world is too precisely tuned to that world to make the crossing to another. What if the universe isn't a dark forest full of predators hiding in the silence? What if it is a vast ocean, and every form of life that has ever existed is a creature of the shore, shaped completely by the chemistry and physics of one specific coast, unable to survive in the open water, looking from their respective shores at an ocean that none of them can cross, that is a specific and haunting version of the silence. But there is something on the other side of it, something that belongs in the same thought. At the beginning of tonight, we talked about a spacesuit, not as armor, not as a vehicle, as a wearable biosphere. A container built to carry something irreplaceable through an environment that has no interest in its survival. What we said then is still true. And what is inside that container is more remarkable for everything we've learned tonight, not less. A creature made of earth, built of calcium from ancient shallow seas, iron from stellar explosions that predated the formation of the solar system, carbon assembled from the chemistry of the early universe, assembled through billions of years of iteration and error and selection and adaptation into the specific, precise, calibrated organism that evolved on this one world, tuned to one pressure, one gravitational field, one radiation environment, one magnetic shield, one specific community of microbial partners, one set of circadian cues from one star at one average distance. And standing at the edge of the habitat, looking at the stars, choosing to try anyway. What evolution built isn't finished. We are at one moment in an ongoing process. The genes that regulate our DNA repair pathways, the density of our bones, the fluid dynamics of our cerebrospinal system. These are not fixed forever. The conversation about whether to deliberately direct the next stage of that process in the service of surviving a crossing that natural selection never prepared us for is uncomfortable and serious and necessary. But there is also this. The same biology that limits us is the thing that moves us. The curiosity, the drive toward the unknown, the willingness to go somewhere difficult and dangerous in order to understand something. These are not separate from the biology we've been discussing tonight. They are expressions of it. They emerge from the same neural architecture, the same evolutionary history, the same being that is also dissolving bone and shifting fluid and running up against the hard edges of its own design. We look up at the stars because we are built for Earth, and Earth is a world with a sky, and the sky has always had stars in it, and something in the architecture of the brain that evolution built for this planet looks at those stars and generates the experience of wondering what is there. That may be the most specifically human thing about us. Not the technology, not the engineering, the wondering, the choosing to try. There is a specific thought experiment that researchers in astrobiology use when they are trying to communicate the scale of the Fermi paradox. It goes something like this. Take the most conservative assumptions. Assume that only 1 in a million stars has a habitable planet. Assume that only 1 in a million habitable planets actually develops life. Assume that only 1 in a million life-bearing planets develops intelligent life. At those odds, 1,000,000 to 1, 3 times over, you would still expect roughly 100 intelligent civilizations to have emerged in the Milky Way over its 13 billion year history. And those civilizations had 13 billion years to develop technology. Even at a tiny fraction of the speed of light, a civilization with the technology to travel between stars could colonize the entire galaxy in 10 to 100 million years, which is a long time from a human perspective, and a very short time from the perspective of a 13 billion-year-old galaxy. So if even one civilization in the galaxy's history achieved interstellar travel, the galaxy should be full of evidence of it by now. Artifacts, signals, structures, something. We see nothing. The silence is the data point, and the great filter is the attempt to explain it. What stopped them? What stopped every civilization that has ever existed in this galaxy from leaving evidence that persists to the present? The biological interpretation of the great filter, the one that this evening's science points toward, is not the most popular answer in the literature. The more discussed answers involve civilizations destroying themselves, nuclear war, engineered pathogens, climate catastrophe, the various ways that intelligence and technology together might be a volatile combination. These are the filters that tend to feature in policy discussions and science fiction. But the biological filter is subtler and in some ways more insidious because it doesn't require self-destruction. It just requires that interplanetary travel be harder than it looks at the biological level, harder than any amount of engineering can fully compensate for. Consider, every form of complex life that has ever existed on Earth evolved in relationship to Earth-specific conditions, not approximately similar conditions. These exact conditions on this exact planet, the gravity, the magnetic field, the radiation environment, the atmospheric pressure, the temperature range, the day length, the specific mix of nutrients available in the biosphere. Life didn't evolve to be generally robust. It evolved to fit this place. The fit is precise. The precision is the problem. What if this is universal? What if wherever life emerges, it emerges in precise relationship to its home world, and the precision of that relationship is exactly what prevents it from surviving anywhere else? What if the great filter is not a catastrophe, but a constraint? The constraint of biology on geography. If that interpretation is correct, then the universe might be full of life. Complex life, intelligent life, life that looks up at the stars, just as we do, and wonders about what exists out there. Life that develops the mathematics and the physics and the rocketry to contemplate the journey, and then discovers, in attempting it, what we are discovering now, that the body is the limiting factor, that the biology built for one world breaks down in the void between worlds, that the crossing, whatever the engineering achieves, extracts a biological cost that the traveler cannot afford to pay. That is a haunting image, not malevolent, not dramatic, just quiet. A universe full of creatures looking upward from the worlds that made them, unable to reach each other across the distances between. But here is where the thought experiment needs a complication, because the data we have reviewed tonight doesn't actually support a complete biological impossibility. It supports a profound difficulty, and there is a difference between profoundly difficult and impossible that matters enormously. What the biology of spaceflight tells us is not that humans cannot go to Mars. It tells us what the cost is, in biological terms, of going to Mars as we currently are, with the biology we currently have, and the countermeasures we currently possess. It says this will damage the radiation biology, and the skeletal system, and the visual system, and the immune system, and the behavioral health, to a degree that current countermeasures can mitigate but not eliminate. That is a solvable problem, in principle, if the solution space includes modifications to the biology itself, which is the conversation that is just beginning. And there is something worth holding here, in the drift towards sleep. The same neural architecture that produced the wonder, that looks up at the sky and generates the experience of curiosity, of longing, of wanting to go there, also generated the scientific method, the systematic way of asking questions and testing answers and building knowledge incrementally, one carefully conducted study at a time. We know things now that we didn't know before people went to space. We know because people went to space and came back changed, and the changes were measured, and the measurements generated questions, and the questions generated research, and the research generated knowledge. The price of learning what space does to the body was, and continues to be, paid by the people who go there. That is how the knowledge advances. And the knowledge is what makes the next mission safer than the last one, and the next one safer still. Not exponentially. Biology doesn't work on exponential timescales the way semiconductor manufacturing does, slowly, carefully, one study at a time, one crew at a time, one red risk crossed off the list, replaced by a better characterized, better mitigated, still serious problem. The picture is not hopeless. It is honest. And honest, when the stakes are this high, is what matters most. The image I keep returning to when I try to hold all of this together is an ordinary one. A person lying in bed, in a house, on a planet. Outside the window, the night sky. The same stars that every human being who has ever lived has looked up at, in every civilization and every geography and every era of this species' existence on Earth. The same light, from the same distant sources, arriving at the same human retina that evolved to receive it. That retina was shaped by this planet, by the light levels of Earth's surface, by the day-night cycle of one rotation every 24 hours, by the specific wavelengths of sunlight filtered through this specific atmosphere. The eye we use to look at the stars is an instrument built for Earth, being used to observe the universe beyond Earth. It was not designed for the purpose. It just happens to work well enough, and we happen to be the kind of creature that looks. That gap between what we were designed for and what we aspire to is the whole story of human ambition. We were designed for walking. We built bicycles, then trains, then aircraft, then spacecraft. We were designed for communicating at the range of a shouted voice. We built drums, then writing, then printing, then radio, then the internet. We were designed to live and die within a few hundred kilometers of where we were born. We built civilization and trade routes and sailing ships and eventually the infrastructure of a global species. Every one of those extensions required building tools to compensate for the limits of the biology. The tools were built outside the body and operated by the body and extended what the body could do without changing what the body fundamentally was. The question we are approaching now for the first time in human history is whether the next extension, the extension to another planet, requires something different. Not tools built outside the body, changes made inside it, to the genome, the proteome, the cellular machinery that runs the organism. Changes that would make the body itself better suited for the environment it aspires to inhabit. That is a different kind of ambition, a deeper kind, and it raises questions that the previous extensions didn't raise. Because when you change the tool, you leave the tool in the shed when the job is done. When you change the organism, you take the change with you wherever you go, and the changes persist, and they can be inherited. The researchers who are beginning this conversation are aware of all of this. The ethical frameworks they are developing are careful and slow and filled with caveats. The science is still far ahead of the technology, but the conversation is happening, and it will continue to happen because the Mars missions will happen, and the biology will need to be solved, and the biological solutions will require either accepting a level of risk that current standards deem unacceptable, or extending the countermeasures into territory that current biology considers uncharted. What happens next? In the science, in the mission planning, in the ethical debates, in the actual experience of the first crew that makes the journey, is genuinely unknown. The outcome is not predetermined. The future of this question is being written now, by the researchers in the labs and the mission planners at the agencies and the astronaut candidates in training and the ethicists asking the questions that nobody has had to ask before. We are at the beginning of something, not the end of the question, the beginning of the reckoning with it, and that, in the quiet of the night, has its own kind of grandeur. Tonight, we explored the real reason that surviving deep space is so much harder than it looks on the concept renders. Not the engineering, not the distance considered in the abstract, not the propulsion systems or the life support calculations or the radiation shielding as a standalone problem with a standalone solution. The body. The radiation that moves through spacecraft walls as though they are not there, leaving molecular wreckage in its wake that the cell's repair machinery has no protocol for. The fluid that climbs toward the skull and presses quietly on the back of the eye and nudges the brain toward the top of its cavity. The bone that remembers Earth's pull by losing itself without it. 1% per month, compounding over 30 months. The mind that counts the days in both directions simultaneously and finds the middle stretch the longest and the heaviest. We covered a lot of ground tonight, and almost none of it was simple. But here is the thing that sits beneath all of it, and that might be the only thing worth carrying into sleep. We know things now that nobody knew in 1961, in 1972, even in 2010. We know the one-carbon pathway and what it does to the eye in microgravity, and we know that targeted B vitamin supplementation may interrupt it. We know the rate of bone loss and the exercise regimes that slow it, and the dietary adjustments that stop the food from accelerating it. We know the third quarter phenomenon and the behavioral patterns that precede psychological decline, and the countermeasures, both social and pharmacological, that can soften the trajectory. We are building computational models that can predict individual physiological responses to the interplanetary environment from molecular profiles established before the mission begins. We are designing AI-assisted surgical systems for the medical emergencies that no crew member should face alone, hundreds of millions of kilometers from the nearest hospital. We are having, carefully, seriously, in peer-reviewed journals and research programs, the conversation about whether the mission ultimately requires genetic modifications to the biology of the people who make it. What was built here remembers here, in the bone density calibrated to Earth's gravity, in the immune system trained by the microbiome of this specific planetary surface, in the cardiovascular system shaped to push blood upward against 9.8 meters per second squared. All of it carries the information of this world in its structure. And at the edge of the biological question, the great filter question, the question of whether life anywhere can truly cross the distances between worlds, there is no comfortable answer yet. Perhaps there won't be one for a long time. But the same biology that limits us is the thing that moves us. The same body that loses bone and reshapes its eyes and shifts its brain in the absence of gravity is the body that built the spacecraft. That trained for the mission. That strapped in anyway. We are not built for the void. We are built for here, for this specific, beautiful, improbable world, for the pressure and the gravity and the magnetic shelter and the thin blue layer of sky that has been here for billions of years, holding the conditions of life together against the indifference of everything beyond it. And still we reach. There is something in that worth holding on to, in the quiet of the night. Not the ambition exactly, not the engineering or the mission architecture or the risk matrices and the countermeasure protocols. Something simpler. We are creatures of a particular shore. We are completely, precisely, miraculously suited to one stretch of coast. And we look out at the ocean and we want to go there. That is not a limitation. That is who we are. Thank you for drifting through the dark with Cosmic Drift tonight. If this kind of space science, told softly, is what you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. We'll be here the next time the night gets quiet, and you want to go somewhere far and come back rested. Until next time. Cosmic drift, space science, told softly. There is a particular quality to the knowledge that we carry away from an honest accounting of our biological limits. It is not discouraging in the way that defeat is discouraging. It is more like the specific clarity that comes from seeing something accurately for the first time. The thing you were always looking at from a comfortable distance, through softening assumptions, suddenly resolved into its actual contours. The human body is remarkable, not in the general motivational poster sense of the word, in the specific technical biological sense. The number of systems operating simultaneously, the precision of their regulation, the elegance of their interactions, the adaptability they display within the range of conditions they were built for. All of it is genuinely extraordinary. We are the product of billions of years of iterative refinement on a difficult planet, and the result of that refinement is an organism of astonishing complexity and capability. And it was built for here, precisely, completely, entirely here. That is both the source of its capability and the source of its vulnerability in the context of space exploration. The same precision that makes human physiology so effective on Earth makes it fragile in the specific ways that the interplanetary environment attacks. The radiation that fractures DNA in clustered patterns, the repair systems can address. These repair systems are fine-tuned to the radiation environment of Earth's surface, shielded by the magnetosphere. The fluid shifts that reshape the eye and displace the brain. The fluid dynamics were calibrated to 9.8 meters per second squared of gravitational pull. The immune alterations, the microbiome shifts, the circadian disruptions, the behavioral attrition. Each one is the expression of a system operating outside the envelope it was built for. This is not a failure. It is a description. An accurate, measurable, quantifiable description of what happens at the edge of the human ecological niche. And here is what that description actually tells us, if we read it carefully. We have found the edge. Not everyone finds the edge of their niche, while they still have a chance to respond to what they find there. We found it with 60 years of careful observation, during a period of human technological development, where the tools to understand what we were finding, the MRI machines and the genetic sequencers and the radiation dosimeters and the behavioral assessment protocols, were being built alongside the spacecraft. We found it with enough time and enough scientific infrastructure to begin developing responses. The responses are imperfect and incomplete. The digital twins are models with large uncertainties. The gene editing discussions are preliminary and carry risks we cannot fully predict. The AI surgical systems are early-stage technologies. The behavioral support architecture for a Mars mission is still being designed. The food system for 30 months in interplanetary space has not been finalized, but the direction is clear and the momentum is real. We are not standing at the edge of the human niche, looking out at the void and concluding that the void wins. We are standing at the edge, measuring it precisely, and beginning the work of figuring out how to extend the boundary. That is where we are, at the threshold. The body as it exists today, and the environment as it is, and the honest gap between them, and the science working carefully on both sides of that gap, trying to close it. Whatever we discover out there, whatever answers exist, if any, to the great silence of the Fermi paradox, the body will remember where it came from. Calcium and iron and carbon assembled on a blue world in the outer arm of an ordinary galaxy, shaped for 4 billion years by that world's specific physics and chemistry. carrying all of that history into a universe that did not make us and does not particularly accommodate us, and still reaching, still looking, still choosing to try. Sleep well tonight. You are home. You are exactly where your biology built you to be. And that is, in the end, not a small thing. There is a version of the story we tell ourselves about space exploration that is only about heroism and engineering. The spacecraft and the launch and the landing and the return. The flags and the footprints and the photographs taken in extraordinary places. That version is true, and it is inspiring, and it contains genuine human courage of a kind that deserves to be celebrated. But there is another version that runs underneath it, the version that lives in the medical data and the bone density scans and the behavioral questionnaires and the retinal images taken aboard the station by astronauts examining their own eyes in orbit. The version where the heroism is quieter and more continuous, where it consists not of a single dramatic moment, but of month after month of maintaining function, maintaining professionalism, maintaining physical and psychological health against the steady biological pressure of an environment that was never designed to accommodate you. That version is also true, and it is the version that the science asks us to hold alongside the more dramatic one. Not instead of it, alongside it. Because the people who go to space carry both stories in their bodies. The story of what they are capable of, extraordinary things genuinely, and the story of what they are paying at the biological level for being capable of those things in that environment. The debt gets paid eventually, in the years after return, when the bones continue, their recovery and the cardiovascular system readapts, and the eyes gradually, partly, settle back toward baseline. In the increased lifetime risk of radiation-induced illness, the number on Cucinotta's graph, the statistical shadow that follows the mission home. This is not an argument against going. It is an argument for going with clear eyes, for understanding what is actually being asked of the body, for building the science and the medicine and the countermeasures and the support systems that make the asking fair, that make the exchange between human ambition and human biology as sustainable as it can be made. The science is building, the knowledge is growing. The researchers who spend their careers on bone loss and radiation biology and SANS and behavioral medicine are doing work that will make the missions safer than they would otherwise be. That matters. It matters to the specific people who will make the crossing, whose individual health and lives depend on how well the science has done its job. We belong to this world, in the deepest, most biological sense of the word. In the calcium and the iron and the carbon assembled here, shaped here, refined here, over the entire arc of life on this planet. And we are reaching anyway. That is the story, both parts of it. The belonging and the reaching, the precision of the fit and the imprecision of the aspiration. The body built for Earth, pointed at the stars. Good night. Drift well. The stars will still be there when you wake up, and so will we.